Welcome. If you enjoy imagining nights by the fireplace, quiet stone halls, ancient castles, and life in medieval villages, you've found your resting place. Subscribe for more peaceful stories from a quieter, older world. Now, let's begin. The sky had not always looked like this. So soft, so forgiving. For weeks, for months, the air had been still and dense, or bitter and biting, or heavy with smoke from candles lit for morning. But now, as the sun leaned low over the hills and reached its golden fingers across the valley, it felt like the world itself was exhaling. A long-held breath let go. You stood just beyond the edge of your cottage, barefoot in the narrow patch of green that had begun to reappear among the hard-packed earth. The grass was shy this year, patchy and low, but it had returned, and with it, so had something else. A feeling, maybe, one you hadn't dared give a name to yet, but it lived there, in your chest, warm and slow and steady. The village was quiet, but not in the same way it had been during the darkest days. Then, the silence had been thick, hollow, a kind of absence that settled into doorways and behind window panes, as if the air itself had been afraid to speak. Now the quiet was a different thing altogether. Now, it was rest. It was stillness, not fear. It was the sound of something old and aching beginning to remember how to be alive. A cart rolled gently down the lane behind you, its wooden wheels creaking as it passed over smooth stones worn by years of feet and hooves. You turned slightly to watch it, a familiar face at the reins, someone who had once sold honey at the summer fair. His shoulders stooped more now, but his hands held the reins. He was guiding something forward. You nodded to him. He nodded back. Nothing needed to be said. The shared glance was enough. You pulled your shawl closer around your shoulders. The fabric was rough woven and familiar, its edges frayed but still whole. It smelled faintly of smoke and herbs and of your own skin. You hadn't needed it earlier in the day when the sun was high, but now as the light slanted lower, the breeze carried a coolness with it, clean and new, like water from the well after a long drought. You looked out toward the hills. The trees there had begun to leaf again, tiny greens poking out from twisted branches. Birds moved between them, calling out in bursts that were hesitant at first, then growing bolder. Their songs had returned only recently. For so long they had stayed away, as if they too had sensed the illness in the soil, the breathlessness of the world. But they were back now, not in flocks, not in choirs, but in pairs, in solo voices, in quiet, careful offerings of music. From your doorway, you could see the chapel at the far end of the village. Its roof had been patched with mismatched tiles, some red, some black, some pale gray, but it stood firm. The bell tower was still. For months that bell had tolled daily, not for mass, not for celebration, but for loss, for names, for the sound of parting. Today, it did not ring. It had not rung in several days now. That was how you measured time lately. Not in numbers or dates, but in the presence or absence of that sound. The villagers had grown used to it, the way one grows used to the creak of an old door or the whisper of a draft. But now that it had stopped, the quiet it left behind felt new again. Not eerie, just still. You stepped back inside your cottage, The wooden floor groaned underfoot, a familiar song of soft protest. The hearth was cold but clean. You had swept it that morning, removing the last of the soot that had clung there from long nights spent keeping watch. There were fewer candles now, fewer herbs hanging from the rafters. You'd stopped needing to ward the air. On the table sat a bowl of dried lentils, a wedge of bread, and a small dish of salt. Simple things, but they felt precious. There had been weeks when even these were gone, when you'd traded memories for food, an old apron for grain, a keepsake comb for oil. Now, slowly, things returned. No abundance, but enough. A few petals from the dried lavender bunch on the shelf had fallen to the table. You brushed them gently to the side with the tips of your fingers, watching them drift like whispers to the floor. Outside again, the breeze shifted. You heard the slow creak of shutters being opened across the lane. One by one, little by little, windows that had been closed against the world were opening again. Cloth drapes fluttered, and a pale hand reached out to shake dust from a cushion. You recognized the hand. You had not seen its owner for many weeks. You smiled. The gesture was small, but so was the first bud before the blossom. You walked to the fence that circled the back garden. It had slumped slightly in the rainstorms of early spring, and one of the stakes was loose. You pressed it gently back into the soil, not firmly, just enough to tell the fence you still cared. The earth around it was damp and cool. When you brought your fingers to your nose, they smelled of loam and something else. Life. A sparrow landed near your feet. It cocked its head at you, then hopped once, twice, and took flight again. You followed it with your eyes until it disappeared into the low branches of the ash tree at the end of the lane. The ash had survived. Not every tree had. Not every soul had. But this one stood tall, its trunk mottled with lichen, and its base ringed by tufts of new grass. You remembered tying ribbons to its branches during the midsummer festival years ago, and you wondered if the children would dance around it again someday. You hoped so. Not soon, but someday. Back in the village square, someone was sweeping. The sound came faint, but clear, the rhythmic scrape of bristles over stone. You turned toward it instinctively, eyes finding the movement. It was the baker's son. His father had passed weeks ago, but the boy was older now. You could see it in the way he held the broom, not like a chore, not like a child, like someone learning to carry something. The square itself was still mostly empty. No carts, no vendors, no laughter. But the stones had been cleaned of soot and ash. The corners no longer held offerings or burnt incense. The prayer candles that once flickered in glass jars were gone, their wax melted and wiped away. In their place stood flowers, not in bouquets, not arranged, just placed. A daisy on a windowsill, a sprig of thyme on a doorstep, a single yellow petal floating in the water trough by the well. You had placed that one yourself. You hadn't even thought much about it when you did it, only that the color had felt right, that it should be somewhere visible, that something soft should meet the eyes of anyone who passed by. That night, you dreamed of spring. Now, here you were, living in it. Or something close. The sun had begun to lower behind the hill, and the sky had taken on that faint pink gold tint that only lasts for minutes at the end of the day. You stood still, letting it brush your face. The shawl around your shoulders shifted in the breeze again, and you pulled it tighter, not because you were cold, but because the weight of it felt right, familiar, steady. A bell rang faintly, not the chapel bell, but the little hand bell carried by the old woman who had once marked the time for the village children. You hadn't heard it in months, but now it rang 3 times. Clear, slow, a call to return home before dark. You closed your eyes, not to sleep, not yet. Just to be in the sound for a moment, to feel the air on your skin, to listen to the wind moving through the narrow alleys and up between the eaves of the cottages, to feel the slow, deep heartbeat of a village beginning to remember itself. When you opened your eyes again, the stars had begun to prick at the edges of the sky. Just 1 or 2, faint and far away. But present, you watch them appear, one by one, steady, unrushed, like breath returning to a long-held silence. Morning came not with fanfare, but with birdsong. It was the kind of morning that arrived gently. No rush, no sudden brightness, just a slow warming of light through the shutters, the steady unfolding of day across the rooftops of the village. The roosters had crowed early, as they always had, but you hadn't stirred at first. You let the sound pass over you like water. Only when the sun touched your eyelids, gold through the cracks in the shutters, did you rise. The cottage smelled of wood smoke and wool. Your blanket had fallen halfway to the floor, and you pulled it back around your shoulders as you sat on the edge of the bed. Your feet met the cool wood with a soft thud, and you pressed them flat against the floor, breathing in slowly, letting your body remember itself. It was the first day in a long time you didn't wake with a knot in your chest. The ache of worry, of checking if a fever had arrived in the night, of wondering which house across the village might be mourning next. That ache had quieted. It had not vanished. Grief leaves behind echoes. But today, you did not wake in fear. You moved slowly through your morning, lighting the small hearth, setting a pot of oats to simmer, washing your face in a basin by the window. The water was cold, but it cleared the last haze of sleep from your mind. Outside, the village was beginning to stir. You could hear it, even before stepping into the street. The clink of a pail at the well, the scrape of a broom on stone, the low murmur of voices, 2, maybe 3, spoken with care, not loud enough to wake anyone still dreaming, but no longer hushed as they had been during the worst days. You wrapped your shawl tighter and stepped out into the lane. The sun touched everything gently, the mossy edges of the cottages, the bundled hay near the barn, the thatch roof slick with dew. The world smelled of wet grass and cooling ash. The scent of the village not quite scrubbed clean, but softened. A few steps down the path, you passed your neighbor, Thomas, kneeling beside his front step, repairing the stones that had crumbled during the winter. He looked up, met your eyes, and gave a small nod. You offered one in return. Neither of you spoke. The quiet between you was not awkward, it was full of shared understanding, full of relief that didn't need to be named. You moved on, your feet crunching gently on the gravel. The breeze stirred the hem of your tunic, and you paused by the garden wall just to feel the air again. It carried warmth, real warmth. Not the dry, bitter heat of a fevered summer, but the kind that came with planting, with baking bread, with animals stretching in the pasture. A low bleat from the edge of the field caught your ear. One of the goats had gotten her head stuck through the fence again, and the farmer's daughter, perhaps 11 or 12 now, was gently trying to coax her back. You watched as the girl murmured softly, her hands calm, her movements patient. A moment later, the goat pulled back, unharmed and chewing calmly, as if nothing had happened. The girl glanced up, caught your eye, and smiled. It was a small thing, but it glowed. You walked further into the village center, past the bakery, now open for the first time in what felt like ages. The smell of flour and wood-fired ovens hung in the air. A small queue had formed. Only a few people, each standing with polite space between them. Not out of fear now, but respect. Everyone carried baskets, most stood in silence. But here and there, you heard snippets of quiet conversation. They say, the barley harvest may come early this year. The blacksmith has reopened his forge. I saw her walking this morning by the chapel with her youngest. Each word was like a stitch, pulling the torn edges of the village back together, little by little. You joined the line, your hands folded over the handle of your empty basket. When it was your turn, the baker's wife handed you a round loaf with a crust that crackled faintly as you took it. She didn't charge you. She only met your gaze and said, "It's good to see you up and about." You nodded. Your voice was caught in your throat, but the warmth in her eyes made words unnecessary. Further down the lane, you passed the carpenter's workshop. The shutters had been opened wide, letting sunlight in. The smell of sawdust drifted through the air, soft and familiar. The old man who worked the wood was bent over a table, sanding down a beam. His dog lay nearby, tongue out, tail thumping softly against the floor. A young apprentice stood to one side, sorting nails. The rhythmic sound of work, sanding, hammering, placing, created its own kind of music. You closed your eyes for a moment, letting it fill your chest. You wandered to the chapel steps, which now served more as a gathering place than a sanctuary. 2 older women sat nearby on a bench, sewing quietly, their hands nimble despite the wear of grief. They stitched patches onto cloaks, onto sleeves worn thin over the last season. One of them looked up as you passed. She gestured to the empty spot beside her. You hesitated only a moment before sitting. A third woman handed you a scrap of fabric and a threaded needle. You said nothing. They said nothing. You began to sew. The village didn't need noise, it needed hands. Hands working, mending, placing one thread after another. The stitches weren't perfect. The lines wobbled. The thread tangled once or twice. But it held. The cloth held. You stayed like that for a while, the sun slowly climbing toward its highest point, your fingers warming against the soft cotton of a well-worn cloak. When you stood again, your back ached slightly, but it felt good. useful, alive. The rest of the day unfolded gently. You saw a boy carrying a bucket of fresh water, sloshing it onto his boots with each step. You watched a woman sweep the leaves from her doorstep, and then simply stand in the sunlight. You heard the faint sound of a flute drifting down from someone's open window. At one point, you paused beside the well and dipped your hands into the cool water, letting it pool in your palms. You drank slowly. The water was sweet. It tasted of stone and sky and the season ahead. You looked around the square and felt something you hadn't felt in many weeks. Not just relief, not just endurance, but rhythm. The rhythm of life returning. Of labor, not heavy, not forced, but shared, quiet, measured. Someone was rebuilding the wheelbarrow that had collapsed last fall. Another was spreading seed in the garden that had gone untended for too long. You passed the weaver's shop and saw a child holding a scrap of blue wool, running their fingers along its edge as if it were treasure. You caught sight of your reflection in a window pane and paused. Your face looked different than it had in the deepest weeks of sickness. There were lines of fatigue still, a hollowness in the eyes that would take longer to leave. But there was color again in your cheeks. There was breath in your chest. You looked like someone living, and the village around you looked like a home again. Not perfect, not whole, but alive. You returned to your cottage in the late afternoon, basket heavier now, bread, eggs, and a small pouch of dried herbs gifted to you by the healer's apprentice. She'd smiled as she handed it over, saying it would help with sleep, as if sleep now might be a safe thing again. You set the basket down on the table, washed your hands in the basin, and lit the hearth. A soft fire took hold, not large, just enough to warm the cottage and welcome evening in. You cut a slice of bread, tore it in half, and ate slowly. Each bite felt like ceremony. Outside, the light dimmed. The shadows grew longer. The bird song softened. You moved to your window, placing your palms flat on the sill. The scent of smoke from a neighbor's fire drifted in. You breathed it in, deep and slow. Across the lane, a man lit a lantern and hung it by his door. Its light glowed pale gold, like a promise. You stood there unmoving, as dusk settled into every corner of the village. As the world grew quiet again, not with fear, but with peace. Tomorrow, there would be more work to do. The garden to tend, the roof to patch, the walls to reinforce before summer storms arrived. But tonight was enough. The mending had begun, and the world, in its own quiet way, was beginning to hum again. The morning began with the sound of bread being sliced, not in your own home, but just beyond the shutters, at the cottage next door. You could hear it through the thin air and quiet, the soft scrape of a knife against a wooden board, the gentle rattle of crust flaking away. Then a pause, then the faint clink of a cup being set down. Ordinary sounds, everyday things. But this morning, they landed with the weight of ceremony. You rose slowly, not because you were tired, but because something inside you insisted on taking this moment slowly. The light through the window was soft and golden, and as you moved to unfasten the shutters, it poured in like a blessing. Dust motes drifted in the beams, swirling in quiet spirals. You watched them for a long time before stepping away. Today was the first feast day the village would mark together again. Not a feast in the grand sense. There would be no lavish spread, no dancers, no pipers on platforms, but a shared meal, a table laid out in the square, an altar cleaned and redressed, a day to honor the changing of seasons and those who did not live to see it. The last time the day had come, the chapel had been shuttered. The bells had stayed silent. This time the bell would ring once at midday. You dressed carefully, not in your finest. No one was dressing in finery these days, but in a clean tunic, sleeves rolled and apron tied neatly. You brushed your hair with deliberate strokes, pinning it back with the carved wooden clasp your grandmother had given you. It was one of the few belongings you hadn't considered trading during the worst weeks. Today, you were glad you'd kept it. Outside, the lane was already busy, but not chaotic. The movement of the villagers had its own rhythm, quiet, certain, like an old dance remembered in the body. A pair of boys carried stools down to the square. A young mother swept the walkway in front of her door, her daughter trailing behind her with a cloth-wrapped bundle of wildflowers. The baker's boy rode a cart with loaves stacked high, shouting gentle greetings as he passed. Morning to you. Save me a corner crust. Don't eat it all before you get there. There was laughter, real, round and full. You smiled at it, then made your way to the chapel with a basket on your arm. Inside it, a small bowl of stewed lentils, a cloth-wrapped wedge of hard cheese, 2 rolls, and a single apple. Enough to contribute, enough to share. The chapel stood with its doors flung wide open. For the first time in over a year, the altar had been polished. Its cloth, a deep, dusty blue, hung freshly laundered, and beside it stood a vase of rosemary and thyme, their scent rising warmly into the air. Several people had gathered already, placing offerings of food and herbs and small tokens in the baskets arranged at the front. You placed yours with the others and gave a small nod to the healer who stood beside the door. Her eyes met yours, and without words, she passed you a folded slip of linen. Inside was a bit of lavender and yarrow. For peace, she said softly. You tucked it into your apron pocket and moved to help arrange the benches outside. Throughout the morning, more people arrived. Some carried loaves, others jars of preserved fruit, bunches of herbs, or carefully wrapped pies. Children darted through the crowd like birds, laughter trailing behind them like ribbons. Someone began plucking the strings of a lute, not a song exactly, but notes, one after another, like testing the voice of an instrument too long silent. You took your place at the edge of the long wooden table now being set. It was just a pair of planks, balanced on old barrels and crates, but it held its shape well. You laid out cutlery, wiped down mugs, helped place folded cloths where they could. No one gave orders. People simply saw what was needed and stepped forward. The sun climbed slowly, golden and benevolent. At midday, the chapel bell rang once. Its sound rang out over the hills, clear, long, and low. People paused where they stood, Heads bowed, hands stilled. No formal prayer was spoken. None was needed. The bell was enough. Its toll carried every name, every breath, every tear shed, and every breath yet to come. Then slowly, the movement resumed. The shared meal began. There were no long speeches, no formal seating, just the quiet clink of mugs being filled, the murmur of appreciation for warm bread. The smile passed from one person to the next as they broke cheese into hunks and offered fruit to nearby children. You sat beside the woman who ran the dye shop, her hands permanently stained with color, and across from the shepherd who'd lost half his flock, and his father. He said little, but his eyes were kind. You offered him a fig. He accepted. Someone began to sing. You didn't recognize the melody at first, just a low, winding tune, like a lullaby sung from across a room. Then others joined in. No harmony, no instruments, just voices, soft and varied. Old voices, young voices, voices that cracked in the throat but kept going anyway. It wasn't a hymn. It was older than that. A harvest song, perhaps. Or one sung at the start of spring when the first sprouts broke through the frost. You hummed quietly along, not needing to know the words. By mid-afternoon, the food had dwindled, but the warmth had grown. Small groups lingered around the edges of the square. Two boys challenged each other to balance on the edge of the stone well, arms flailing for fun. A girl showed her friends how to braid grass into bracelets. An older man recited a joke that made several people groan, and one burst out laughing in surprise. You noticed the carpenter's daughter tying flowers to the chapel's doorframe with twine. You joined her. The stems were uneven, the blooms mismatched, but beautiful all the same. She handed you a handful of petals, and you tucked them into the crook of the frame, careful not to crush them. When you were done, you stepped back and looked at the archway now lined with color. "It's not perfect," she said quietly. "No," you agreed, "but it's good." As the sun began its slow descent toward the hills, people started returning home. You stayed a while longer, helping gather the plates, wiping the benches, carrying the empty jugs to be cleaned. The lute player was still strumming in the distance, now joined by someone on a reed flute. Their tune was slow, wandering, half-finished, but full of something new. Joy, maybe, or simply peace. On your walk home, the wind carried the scent of loam and baked fruit. You passed a line of herbs drying outside a cottage, their scent familiar and anchoring. A mother rocked a baby on her stoop. The baby was quiet, eyes wide, watching, learning the sounds of a village returning to itself. You reached your cottage and paused by the gate. A bird landed on the fence post, brown and soft and wholly unremarkable, and chirped once, then flew away. Inside, you placed your linen pouch beside your bed, added a bit of mint to the hearth tea, and watched the embers grow. You kicked off your shoes, stretched your feet, and sat down with the ease of someone who had done a full day's work, not out of obligation, but of belonging. The bell had rung. The food had been shared. The song had been sung. You had tied flowers to a chapel door, not because you had to, because you could. And tomorrow you would do something else. Not all things, not everything at once, but something. And that was enough. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear again, their quiet arrival a ritual all its own. You watched them from your window, not in prayer, not in longing, but in witness. And you let your breath slow, your body soften, your heart rest. The sound of a spade slicing into earth carried farther than you might expect in the early morning hush. You could hear it from where you stood beside your garden gate, hands tucked into the folds of your apron. A steady rhythm, each thrust met by a short exhale. Across the narrow lane, Marna, the widow who'd once taught all the village children their letters, was digging. Her hands, once more familiar with chalk and parchment, now gripped the worn wooden handle of a spade with quiet determination. The plot she worked wasn't large, just enough for a few rows of beans and maybe a patch of onions, but it was something. And you could see by the way she moved that she was letting the earth carry something for her. Something heavy, not grief, not exactly, that had rooted itself too deep to lift now, but something near it. The weight of a season past. You turned toward your own plot and bent to work. It wasn't much. No one's garden was this year. But your soil, though crusted with spring's chill and a scatter of old wind-blown leaves, was forgiving. As your fingers dug through the top layers, loosening what had hardened over the winter, you found pockets of softness, life, waiting. The first thing you planted was not food, but a row of marigolds, bright and stubborn little things. Their seeds were small as pinheads, yet everyone held a golden promise. Your mother had always said, marigolds guarded a garden, not just against pests, but against ill luck. You did not believe in such things as you once had. Or perhaps you did. But now it felt less like superstition and more like tradition, something held and handed down in love. The sun had not yet crested the chapel spire when the first voice called out across the lane, "Anyone have sprigs of mint?" You looked up to see Thomas, the smith's apprentice, his face flushed and hair still mussed from sleep. A hand raised, hopeful. From behind a shutter, someone replied, "I've got lemon balm. I'll take it." And so, the exchange began. Not of coin, but of things grown and stored and remembered. A jar of chickpeas for a clutch of early eggs, a pot of honey for a roll of twine. The children became messengers, darting from stoop to stoop, delivering bunches of rosemary, mismatched spools of thread, a single duck egg wrapped in cloth like a treasure. At the far edge of the village, near the tree line, the old field had been opened again. You made your way there after tending your small garden, shawl draped loosely over your shoulders, basket in hand. The footpath was narrower than you remembered, overgrown and wild, but familiar underfoot. You passed a hedgerow heavy with dew, a mossy boulder where bees were already beginning to stir, and a narrow brook, its waters trickling clear between polished stones. When you arrived, you found more the village had gathered than you'd expected. A dozen or more, standing in a loose circle around the field, tools in hand, boots muddy. They did not speak at first, they only looked. The land had gone fallow over the past year. The furrows were barely visible now, softened by time and the creeping roots of wildflowers. The grass had grown high in some parts, low in others, but there was something beautiful about it, its quiet resilience, the way it had held space while the world above it trembled. Then, without instruction, someone began to walk the perimeter. Others followed, a slow procession, not unlike those once made for planting blessings or summer rites. You stepped in beside Marna, the school teacher, her spade now resting against her shoulder. "What are we doing?" she whispered, half laughing. "Blessing it, I think," you replied. She nodded, and together you walked the length of the field's edge, boots brushing through grass that hissed softly in the breeze. When the circuit was complete, someone took up a hoe and began to break the earth. It was hard work, not the kind that exhausted, but the kind that demanded presence. With every turn of soil, the village released something. Layers of stillness, remnants of fear, the stiff silence that had clung to your bones in colder months. You dug in pairs and small groups, trading tools, sharing water, pausing to stretch and laugh. The children played nearby, gathering flowers and stacking flat stones into cairns. One girl, her cheeks smudged with dirt, handed you a daisy without a word. You tucked it behind your ear. As the morning wore on, the sun warmed the backs of your necks and the field began to change shape. What had looked wild now bore the marks of order, not strict rows, not symmetry, but intention. A garden of community, not perfection. Someone fetched a jug of cider from the chapel cellar, and mugs passed from hand to hand. You drank in slow sips, the tartness sweetened by the warmth of the day and the comfort of calloused hands beside you. Under an oak tree at the field's edge, a group had gathered to sort seed. There was barley and rye, radish and leek, squash and turnip. Some of the seeds were old, taken from last year's store. Others had been found in the pockets of coats worn only at festival time. One small bag, tied with blue ribbon, had been left anonymously on the chapel step 2 days prior. "It feels like planting magic," someone murmured. "Is there any other kind?" came the reply. By late afternoon, the field had been half turned, half planted. It was not finished, but it did not need to be. The land was forgiving. It had waited this long. It would wait another day. You sat in the grass with a piece of crusty bread and an apple from someone's basket. Bees buzzed nearby. Your muscles ached, pleasantly. The wind shifted and brought the scent of thyme and damp stone. Nearby, the smith's apprentice strummed a lyre with clumsy fingers, humming tunelessly to himself. A boy beat a soft rhythm on the upturned belly of a water jug. No one danced. No one clapped. But the music settled over the gathering like a blanket. As shadows grew long and the sky took on its evening blush, you helped gather tools, tie sacks of leftover seed, and stack crates. A few lanterns were lit. Smoke began curling from chimneys in the distance. On the way home, your boots felt heavier, but your steps did not. You paused at the brook, dipping your hands into the cold water. It rushed around your fingers, clean and steady, carrying small pebbles and fragments of leaves downstream. You watched it for a long time, feeling the way it moved without fear. When you reached your cottage, you set your boots by the door and peeled off your outer tunic. It smelled of earth and sunlight. You folded it carefully and placed it on the stool beside your hearth. That night, you cooked simply, just a stew of barley and wild onion, a bit of lentil, a pinch of salt. The scent filled the room, wrapping around the wooden beams, rising into the air like incense. You lit a single candle and let it flicker as you ate. Outside, the stars returned again. This time you didn't wait at the window. You stepped outside, barefoot, standing just beyond the doorway in the cool dirt. Above you, the sky stretched wide and dark and full. Somewhere in the field, seeds lay nestled in fresh-turned earth, and the land dreamed with you. You awoke before the sun, not startled, not rushed, just quietly aware that the day was waiting. The stillness in the room was complete. Even the birds had not yet begun to stir outside the shutters. The faint scent of lavender from the sprig tucked by your bedside lingered in the cool air, and your blanket, warm and rough against your skin, felt like part of the night still clinging to you. You stayed there for a moment, not quite moving. The world was paused, and so were you. Then, with a long exhale, you rose. The floorboards creaked familiarly beneath your feet. You moved through the morning with practiced hands, adding kindling to the hearth, boiling water, laying out a crust of bread. The routines had returned slowly these past weeks, like songs half remembered. Now they were back fully, yet changed, sweeter in their simplicity. You stepped outside with your cup in hand and breathed in the air. It smelled of dew and firewood and something more, something that had no name but lived deep in the chest. Continuance. A rooster called out in the near distance, then a second. Then the first birds began their morning songs, their chirps and trills threading through the branches like ribbons of light. The village, still sleeping in places, hummed with that early silence that speaks of readiness. It would not be a special day, not marked on a calendar or etched into memory by any grand moment, but it would be, in a quieter way, a day worth remembering. Because today, you would rebuild the last part of the bridge, the one that crossed the narrow stream at the far end of the village, the one that had always carried children to the orchard, or lovers to the willow grove, or elders to their morning walks. It had fallen into disuse months ago. The wooden slats had rotted at the base, and moss had claimed the handrails. But yesterday, when the carpenter's daughter crossed it barefoot to gather watercress, it had given way beneath her. She was fine, only a scratch on her palm, but her laugh afterward had stirred something in everyone. It was time to mend it. And so the plan was made. By mid-morning, the sun was high and the village fully awake. You had gathered your tools, a small satchel of nails, and a bundle of dry board salvaged from the back of the cooper's shed. Others were already making their way to the site. Tomas with his hammer, Marna with a pail of wash water, and even the priest, sleeves rolled, carrying a loaf of bread for the workers. The path to the stream wound through the lower edge of the fields, past rows of pea shoots now climbing their stakes, and wheat still low but green. You paused once, mid-journey, to pick a wildflower growing in the tall grass, a bright cornflower, blue as the morning sky. You tucked it behind your ear, where it sat snug against your hair. When you reached the bridge, you found the others already at work. The old boards had been cleared, the supports scrubbed and checked. The posts, though mossy, were solid. There was laughter, not loud, but constant, the kind that rises easily when hands are busy and the work is shared. You joined in naturally, passing tools, aligning planks, holding beams while others hammered. No one needed to be told what to do. The rhythm of the village guided you all. Children watched from the bank, skipping stones and playing games. Someone had brought a small clay pot of sweet cider, which passed from hand to hand as the sun climbed higher. At midday, you sat under a sycamore to rest. Your legs were sore, your hands dirty, but your chest felt light. Marna passed you a slice of bread thick with jam and a boiled egg. She had wrapped it in cloth, still warm. You thanked her with a smile, then passed half to a boy sitting nearby. He ate it in silence, eyes wide, cheeks smudged with dust. He had lost both parents in the sickness. The priest had taken him in. Today, he was here helping gather nails, proud and eager. He looked up at you once, mouth full, and gave the smallest nod. You nodded back. That was enough. By late afternoon, the bridge stood whole again. It wasn't beautiful. Not in the old way. The wood didn't match. One side sloped slightly more than the other. The railings were made from salvaged fence posts, but it was strong, and it stood. You were the first to walk across at the carpenter's insistence. The wood creaked under your feet but held. The stream gurgled beneath, playful and cool. On the far side, you turned and raised your arms in quiet triumph. A cheer went up, soft but sincere. Children followed, some with sticks like staffs, some barefoot, arms outstretched as if walking a tightrope. The bridge was more than a crossing. It was a sign that something had been broken, and now it was whole again. That evening, back at your cottage, the breeze carried a melody, someone singing a lullaby from a window down the lane. You didn't know the words, but it didn't matter. You opened your shutters wide, lit a candle, and sat by the glow. Tomorrow would be another quiet day. More gardens to tend, more tools to sharpen, perhaps a visit to the orchard. But tonight, you would rest in this feeling. The village had not simply survived, it had returned. You noticed now how the buildings leaned into each other, how the ivy was allowed to climb again, how the firewood was stacked not just for warmth, but in preparation for stories. The chapel bell had rung at sunset, one clear chime. Not for mourning, not for ceremony, just a note to mark the hour, a heartbeat in the stillness. And the people, your people, were all somewhere close, some behind shutters, some beneath blankets, some still outside tending their fires, but all here, living, and you too were here. You poured one final cup of tea, a blend of mint and linden flower, and wrapped yourself in the shawl that had seen you through each season. The sky was deepening into velvet. The stars blinked awake, unhurried. And in your chest, that old ache had softened into something new. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of peace. You looked out the window one last time and whispered to the night, "We are still here." Then you turned down the wick on the candle, slipped beneath the blanket, and let the silence fold over you like a warm hand. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, and the village slept, whole, mended, reborn.